This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative and their WTC-compatible terrain system. More about them later on. The Nova Open is one of the largest tentpole supermajors in North American Warhammer 40k every year. It's a 400-player event that takes place at a massive miniature gaming convention surrounded by satellite events and other games. And while normally my interaction with the competitive Warhammer 40k community is as a commentator and live streamer, this weekend I actually got to play. So let's talk about my 9 games at the Nova Open 2025, one of the largest events in North America. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I played an insane meme of a list that I had dreamt up in a fever dream, clearly influenced by the Dark Gods. The event used a 2,000-point Strike Force format, and players submit their lists online prior to registration. They are locked into the same list for all 9 rounds of competition. The list I had elected to play was a Greater Demon Stompy list, taking no less than 6 Greater Demons and almost literally nothing else. 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 is often about objective and board control. It's about spreading your army around as much of the board as possible so that when you get particular secondary draws, you are able to range out with light, expendable units and complete them. I did not do that, however. My list had 6 Greater Demons in it. Greater Demons are massive beatstick monsters, ranging from 18 to 20 wounds, more than just about any heavy vehicle in the game, bridging on super heavy or Titan level stat lines. They are ponderous, in some cases slow, but hit like absolute trucks. And in order to shore up this deficiency, I elected to play the Demonic Incursion Detachment, which allows these demons to enter strategic reserve through warp portals and then arrive next to their opponent for easy charges out of Deep Strike. This gives the army an immense amount of control over their position on the board. That gives it a ton of agency and forces its opponent to try to constantly protect themselves from teleporting demons arriving in their backline. Now, the particular demons that I elected to take in this one started with Be'lakor, the Dark Master, who has a bunch of army support effects, including making his army harder to shoot at and allowing demons to teleport near him even in proximity to enemy units, making the teleportation stratagems of the army much stronger. I also brought 2 Khorne Bloodthirsters, Scarbrand, the character Empikero Bloodthirster, who hits like a truck and can give an additional bonus attack to the other Bloodthirster, as well as a standard Bloodthirster with the Argath King of Blades enhancement for additional strength and attacks. These guys are the beatsticks. They want to go into heavy targets and hit them with a huge axe and make them go away. From there, we have our tanks, 2 Great Unclean Ones. One is a standard Great Unclean One with the Endless Gift. His name is Ed. That gives him a 4+ Feel No Pain, allowing him to shake on average 50% of incoming damage. If you combo that with the 4+ Invulnerable save that all Greater Demons have, that allows them to save 50% of all incoming attacks that are not devastating wounds, he essentially shrugs off 75% of incoming damage. On a toughness 13, 20 wound body, that's a lot. And this level of resilience allows you to play this guy fairly aggressively, because your opponent is forced to break upon the rock of his massive bulk. From there, we also have Radicus, who can manipulate opponents' objective control, making it difficult for them to take objectives from me. And we are all melee so far, beyond some incidental shooting that the Greater Demons all possess, so we need a little bit of range punch in there as well. For that, I have taken 1 single bird, a Lord of Change. This guy is equipped with the Everstave enhancement, which gives him additional range and strength on all of his ranged weapons. With the teleportation that the detachment I'm electing to bring allows, he's able to teleport around the table to get angles on enemy utility units or heavier targets, and then peel them away without having to expose my army into the fight. So that leaves us with a couple of extra points to spend on actual units to score the actual game. One of these is going to be a unit of Plague Bearers. These guys have objective secured, which means that when they control an objective, they lock it in under your control, and even if they leave, you're able to retain control of that objective. This is handy to lock down control of your home objective, and then allow your demons to teleport forward without worrying that you're going to lose it unless your opponent also has redeployment or deep strike effects. Now, last and certainly also least is a Sloppity Bilepiper. This guy is a hilarious inclusion. He actually pulses battle shock checks against enemies within 6 inches of him, which is synergistic with the demon army ability, which can force enemies to take damage when they fail battle shock checks. However, the real reason for his inclusion is that he is the single cheapest unit in the entire Demon's Codex that has an objective control value. That allows him to take objectives and perform actions, which means he's good for scoring secondaries. He is simply here to teleport onto the table from a warp rift, perform an action, and then be killed by my opponent, upon which time I will shed a single solitary manly tear. This style of army is called a demonic adventuring party because each different classification of demon tends to fulfill a different role in a classic RPG adventuring party. The Great Unclean Ones are your tanks, the Bloodthirsters are your fighters or rogues, Be'lakor is a support guy, kind of like a cleric maybe, and the Lord of Change is your ranged DPS like a ranger or a wizard. If you want more details about how I play this army and the matchups that I was expecting to see when I went into the event, I do have a video over on my members page if you are interested, breaking it down in further detail. Sponsor time. This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. Now, I've already talked about Lighter Creative on this channel in the past, and their cool and innovative mats as well as WTC-compatible terrain systems. But what they want me to talk to you about today is their updates to their battle mat system. Now, Lighter Creative uses this vinyl-style battle mat. It's a textured material with a felt backing, which makes it super-duper nice on your tabletop. While this is lighter than neoprene, it comes with a ton of advantages, including the fact that it can be folded up rather than requiring it to be rolled because it won't crack and smooths out really easily once you lay it out on the tabletop. Lighter Creative previously created battle mats that were compatible for use with Warhammer 40k, including printed deployment zones and objective markers, and I'm happy to report that they have expanded their selection of these styles of mats, now including new designs. However, they also now have mats that are compatible with multiple game systems. This one, for example, this is a Kelty mat. It's a little baby guy. That's pretty cool, right? They also have less sci-fi themed designs if you're looking for something that's compatible with more of a fantasy game. That said, the Warhammer 40,000 mats do have a ton of advantages. They retain those cool deployment zone and objective marker printouts, as well as including a measurement grid, now with marked sections on the battlefield, so you can actually see very easily where things like your deployment zones or table quarters actually line up. This looks like such an incredible improvement in play experience and makes it easier to score out your objectives, in addition to kind of looking like a battlefield overlay, which is kind of sweet. So check out these mats in the links in the video description. If you're looking to grind games competitively, there's no better mat for you. Round one, I was up against Joe and his Aeldari. Now, Aeldari was one of the matchups that I didn't really want to see on the lead up into the tournament. Units like their fire dragons are incredibly effective at knocking down greater demons, and unfortunately for me, they have a lot of ways to disembark transports, attack, and then re-embark those transports or hide behind buildings so that I can't counterattack them. So a normal strategy of face tanking with my Great Unclean Ones, absorbing the damage, and then counterattacking with Bloodthirsters or my Lord of Change doesn't typically work. That said, Joe's army was a little bit different. He was running an Aeldari War Host, which is a maneuver-focused detachment, allows his units to move very quickly and reposition themselves multiple times per turn. However, it was very light on anti-tank. He was only bringing a couple of Bright Lance platforms, including Warwalkers and Wave Serpents, in addition to a pair of 5-man Fire Dragon units. That is not enough anti-tank to kill 6 greater demons, so I was able to push forward aggressively and basically roll him off the table. Round one, the stat check of 118, toughness 10 plus wounds rolling across the battlefield was successful. And with that, we moved on to round two against Matt and his Death Guard. Now, Death Guard are a scary matchup to run into. They have crazy damage and efficient units, especially with their heavy Blight Launcher blow drones and their Death Shroud Terminators in melee. Now, I don't have a good way to deal with the Death Shroud Terminators. They also have a way to deep strike close to enemies, specifically enemies that are afflicted by their Contagions of Nurgle, and then charge them out of reserve and blow them up. And their weapon profiles are just good enough to basically one-for-one my demons. However, I can dodge a lot of their shooting, and one of the biggest benefits that Death Guard can bring is a contagion that reduces the armor save characteristic of enemies that are nearby them. Fortunately for me, my armor save characteristics are trash. I rely entirely on invulnerable save characteristics which can't be modified, which means that affliction doesn't work. If my opponent can give me -1 to hit, but that's not quite as impactful as taking 17% more damage from literally everything attacking me. Now, one thing I've identified playing this matchup in the past is that the Lord of Change is actually the least valuable player here. And one cool thing about this list is that it can identify particular components in each matchup that you don't necessarily need to win, and then use those components to try to bait your opponent into aggressive plays. And in this case, the Lord of Change was definitely in that category. The profile matchups are really well situated to deal crippling damage to him, and unfortunately, he just doesn't do quite enough damage to reliably kill any of the Death Shroud units in one shot. So he is exposing himself to shoot into a unit that's worth less than 1/3 of what he is, that can probably half kill him in the swingback. So any trade that he makes is almost certainly not worth it. Now, I went first, and with that in mind, played relatively aggressively. I moved forward with my Great Unclean One and pushed out my Lord of Change to get a cheeky attack onto an aggressively placed Myphitic Blightholler. I didn't kill it because his stat line isn't that great. However, I did do enough damage that I might be able to finish it off on the next turn. And that forced my opponent to play kind of cagey. The Lord of Change in the center of the battlefield threatened all of his own shooting and forced it to move back outside of his attack range. Now, that allowed me to take advantage of Be'lakor's aura, which prevents enemies from attacking me from distances farther than 18 inches away, meaning that the majority of his long-range shooting was out of the fight for most of the game. Now, with that in mind, my opponent did take this damaged Blightholler and advance it onto an objective to try to lock it in. He was playing the Virulent Victorium detachment, so if he maintained control of an objective for a full round, it would lock in under his control and become contagioned itself until I was able to move forward and attack it. And given that I don't have a lot of units to try to go wrest control of these objectives, that was relatively scary. So I ended up on round 2 taking a teleport with my Lord of Change, teleporting him to the corner where he could see and shoot at that Myphitic Blightholler. I protected him with Be'lakor, teleporting nearby to protect him from the long-range shooting, and essentially just presented my opponent only my Great Unclean Ones as potential targets for attack. That ended up killing the Myphitic Blightholler and keeping my opponent's primary score low. However, offered up the Lord of Change as a trade, which my opponent gleefully took. He placed Mortarion in an aggressive position with a rapid ingress, deploying him on my own turn. I could then shoot at Mortarion with the Lord of Change, but that would potentially prevent me from killing the Blightholler that was holding down the objective for very little damage to the Death Guard Primarch. What that allowed Mortarion to do is then move up and apply Contagion to the Lord of Change here. That then allowed my opponent to deploy 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators over here in the corner, alongside attached Lords of Contagion. These end up being one of the hardest hitting unit combinations in the entire game. Both of these guys ended up charging onto the Lord of Change, unfortunately preventing Mortarion from getting it to grips with the big bird because his base is too physically large to fit in alongside all of the Death Shroud Terminators. However, it very easily killed the Lord of Change. That presented me a really interesting decision. I could meet my opponent in that fight on the bottom flank of the battlefield and try to outfight 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators and Mortarion, one of the tankiest units in the game, or I could simply rely on the Death Guard's relatively low speed characteristics and not fight at all, which is what I eventually elected to do. I ended up using all of my teleportation to teleport all of my big beatsticks to the other side of the battlefield. I followed up with my own rapid ingress at the end of my opponent's turn onto the central objective in order to maintain control of it and give my Bloodthirster a good avenue into my opponent's backline, where his Plague Marines and the rest of his shooting were hiding. I then used all of the teleportation shenanigans that Demonic Incursion is able to do to move my Bloodthirster forward, project an aura of Shadow of Chaos that I could then use to close deploy Scarbrand also in my opponent's deployment zone. I picked up Be'lakor and used him to attack a bloat drone on the other side of the battlefield and maintained objective control with my Great Unclean Ones, essentially refusing this entire flank, running away with my Plague Bearers so my opponent couldn't get good charges onto them, and forcing these slow Death Shroud Terminators and Mortarion to hide in the corner. He ended up recovering fairly well. He took my home objective with Death Shroud Terminators and pushed towards the center, and a couple of bad rounds of combat with one of my Great Unclean Ones unfortunately knocked down Ed with his Endless Gift. However, by round 5, my lead proved too great for my opponent to catch me without a perfect set of secondary draws. He ended up using New Orders to try to fish into the appropriate secondary draws to win the game, but wasn't able to do so, putting me at 2-0. Now, round 3 was up against Josh and his Imperial Knights. Now, this is a matchup that I have been kind of dreading. Well, I originally actually had built this list to fight against Imperial Knights. I was mostly expecting to fight big, stompy knights, lots of large Cerastus chassis and Questoras class knights that I could fight one-to-one with my greater demons and outnumber them with the greater efficiency of demon profiles. However, I hadn't really considered knights being nerfed to the point where they don't really want to take that many of the large, super heavy Titanic knights anymore, and instead take more of their smaller armigers, which, as it turns out, are way more efficient than my own demon profiles. To make matters worse, Imperial Knights have access to Sky Sweeper protocols. This allows their armiger Helverins, if they are in their own deployment zone or holding an objective marker, to enter an anti-aircraft mode, gaining anti-fly 2+, meaning that all of their relatively low strength autocannons cannons will be wounding all of my high toughness flying demons on 2s, basically allowing my opponent to kill units like my Lord of Change, Bloodthirster, or Bellicor right off the bat as soon as they commit into the fight without having to actually get in and deal damage with any of the heavier knights. This makes this matchup an absolute knife's edge for the demons, and I think makes it one of the tougher matchups in the metagame. Now, my opponent ended up taking the first turn in this matchup and playing things incredibly smart. He kept his big Titanic Knights, of which he had 2 Canis Rex and a Knight Warden, which reduces damage on his armatures, relatively safe. Now, I know what I need to do here is engineer a situation where the larger knights have to move forward to engage with me so that I can counterattack them with the Bloodthirsters. However, he was able to put his damage reduction onto an Armiger Warglaive and push it up to the center of the table, essentially asking me if I wanted to start the peace trading game early. And I elected not to, but in hindsight, maybe I should have. I ended up taking a couple of pot shots at that Armiger, moving my Great and Clean One up to take the objective, and then also keeping things relatively cagey myself, playing a kind of passive game. Unfortunately, that gave my opponent an immense points lead, which, if you are going second, isn't the greatest thing ever in Chapter Proof 2025, because the second player gains scoring at the end of the round if the points are equal. Then the second player has the advantage, which is where I was standing. However, if my opponent gets a big score on turn 1, then that second player's advantage disappears, and my opponent has the benefit and board control. In hindsight, what I probably should have done is pushed my Great and Clean One forward and tried to, alongside the shooting, kill this Armiger, and then use that swing to force the larger knights to move forward, or at least force more of the Armigers to attack the Great and Clean One, and so he can absorb their damage. However, this did encourage my opponent to move forward, which was reasonably the intended play pattern. My opponent brought several Armigers out of strategic reserve in order to take some shots down into this area, as well as pushing forward with his Armigers in order to secure control of the middle of the table. What he didn't do is push forward his Knight Warden, however. Now, that allowed me to set up an incredibly cheeky rapid ingress play that I thought could win me the game. I was able to put my Bloodthirster next to Bellicor and outside 18 inches of any of my opponent's reasonable shooting, so that none of his anti-fly or Canis Rex's attacks could actually attack the Bloodthirster thanks to Bellicor's aura. My opponent was protecting himself by body blocking a lot of the movement avenues to Canis with his Armigers, but on the follow-up turn, after receiving a bunch of shooting from the Armiger Hellfriends into my Great and Clean Ones, I was able to use Warp Surge to advance my Bloodthirster over the intervening models and get a charge into Canis Rex. The rest of my army repositioned to try to deal some additional damage to Canis Rex, although I think I only ended up doing 6 damage with shooting. In hindsight, I may have split my fire a little bit here in order to try to knock down one of the Armiger Warglaives that my Great and Clean One was fighting and make sure that I could kill it so my opponent didn't threaten control of my expansion objective. I was also able to use the Shadows of Chaos to bring a close deep strike with Scarbrands to finish off the damaged Armiger and wrest control of the central objective as well. The other Armigers hadn't moved up to touch that objective. Then the big charge happened. The Bloodthirster went into a damaged Canis Rex, rolled 3 ones to hit and only 2 wounds. Unfortunately, the biggest downside of the Bloodthirster is his inconsistency. He has 9 attacks that hit most things on 2s and wound most things on 3s. On average dice, that means he's oftentimes handing your opponent 5 or so saves, which is normally just fine. They're AP4, they will punch through almost every armor save characteristic known to man, unless you're attacking something with a particularly heavy armor save or a invulnerable save, he's most likely going to kill it. However, he has no access to rerolls whatsoever, unless Bellicor is nearby and turns on his reroll aura, which happens very rarely. Which means that the Bloodthirster oftentimes just rolls a bunch of 1s and then fails to do what you need him to. On top of that, he also has a random damage characteristic on his melee weapon, so sometimes he can also hit and wound all his attacks, but still roll poorly on damage and not kill what he needs to. And unfortunately, he is just about the squishiest demon. The Lord of Change does technically have worse stats, however, the Lord of Change often fights with his opponent from far away, which means the Bloodthirster, if he fails to kill whatever he's attacking, immediately dies. In this case, handing only 2 saves to my opponent out of 9 attacks is a good recipe for a very short life. I did command point reroll 1 to try to get 1 additional through, but I did not end up doing enough damage to Canis, especially because of his Noble Lance 6+ Feel No Pain, which allows him to shake 1 out of every 6 damage that he ends up taking. I think the Bloodthirster ended up handing him about 15 damage, which is not very good. Canis Rex turned around and just slapped him back during my own turn, which was a bit of a disaster. Now, Canis Rex decided to do something incredibly funny, where he charged Skarbrand, whiffed, and also died himself. However, at that point, the writing was kind of on the wall. The game plan here was to deliver the Bloodthirster alongside the shooting into Canis Rex to try to kill him. That would force my opponent's Armigers to come back and kill the Bloodthirster in response, so he doesn't just wreak a bloody path through the Armigers. That would leave the remainder of my Greater Demons untouched and allow them to push through this flank, as well as secure control of the middle and try to win with these 3 objectives on rounds 3 onwards. However, the Bloodthirster dying without absorbing any attacks, and then Skarbrand taking a bunch of damage by being charged by Canis Rex was not in the plan. And unfortunately, my opponent was able to wrest that out to a fairly competitive win towards the end of the game. That, unfortunately, was my first loss of the weekend, and what a heartbreaker it was. In hindsight, I did have some takeaways from the game. My Rodigus spent most of the game kind of hanging out in the back of my deployment zone. Unfortunately, the downside of the Grid Unclean ones is that while they are very tanky and very efficient for their value, they are very large and they're difficult to maneuver around not only terrain features but also each other. And Rodigus ended up stuck behind my Great Unclean one for the majority. I certainly either should have taken my opponent's fight in the center of the table on turn 2, or I should have deep struck Rodigus and used him to threaten the control of my opponent's home objective, where my opponent had a navigator. It says an Imperial agent who can prevent deep strikes coming near him, so he's difficult to deep strike onto, but if I have a unit holding in reserve, I can rapid ingress it and then move up and either shoot or charge the navigator to try to get rid of him on that objective. So that's almost certainly what I should have done. Rodigus did not really contribute that much to the fight until round 3 onwards, and in that case, the writing was already on the wall. So if he had been in reserve earlier, things would have looked pretty good. Or if I had pushed into the center of the table, given space for Rodigus to take my expansion objective, and then use the Great Unclean one to fight the Armigers in the middle, depressing my opponent's score and potentially forcing the larger knights to commit earlier, which is better for me because then I can counterattack them with Bloodthirsters. Either one of those would have been a much stronger play in that matchup. But that did put me into round 4 at 2-1. Now, round 4 was up against Clayton and his Imperial Knights. Once again, we hit the dread matchup 2 games back-to-back. Just my luck. Now, they say that in order to do well in 40k, you do have to be both good and lucky. And, well, I don't know if I'm good. This was certainly the game in which I showcased my skill at rolling dice. Now, in this matchup, my opponent had a larger number of super heavy knights, a Sororitas Knight Atropos, in addition to a Knight Crusader with Mysterious Guardian and Canis Rex. That Mysterious Guardian is an important enhancement. It allows the knight to pick up at the end of my turn and then redeploy during my opponent's next turn in order to get new angles of fire once per game, which meant I had to do my best to try to screen out any of his drops, which forced me to kind of contort myself into a really weird position. Now, I was able to go first and push pretty aggressively. I was able to get my Lord of Change on my expansion objective and push my Great Unclean one into a position where it was threatening the middle. I wasn't really sure that I wanted it to get shot by everything early in the game, so I ended up hiding it while screening out all of my opponent's potential avenues to attack my demons with his one Mysterious Guardian Crusader. My opponent played things fairly cagey, just moving out with some Agents of the Imperium vehicles that he had to hold down his expansion objective, and that forced my hand a little bit. I wanted to keep his primary score low to prevent him from being able to take the victory on the bottom of battle round 5, since I was going first, so my opponent would have that benefit of round 5 scoring. So I ended up teleporting my Great Unclean one and using a 6-inch deep strike to get him onto my opponent's objective. My hope would be that because his screening wasn't particularly profound, he would push a lot of threat up this area, not be able to prevent my Bloodthirsters from teleporting in and fighting Canis Rex and the Sororitas Atropos. If I can kill those 2 things and also tie up the Armiger Helvrens, we'll be in a good spot to try to roll out the game. Now, in response, my opponent did come in and try to attack Ed, the Great Unclean one, and actually ended up making a charge onto an Armiger Helvren, almost killing it with his melee attacks and forcing it to fall back into the center objective somewhere around here. Then he moved up Canis Rex to attack, as well as a Sororitas Atropos, touching the terrain in the center of the battlefield, which means that because of the towering keyword, the Atropos is able to see through. So the Great Unclean one was about to absorb damage from basically my opponent's entire army. In response to this, I saw a cheeky play I thought I could do that would potentially win the entire game for me. In this position, if I used Rapid Ingress, because I had control of my opponent's expansion objective, which meant that I had Shadow of Chaos through the center of the table until the end of his movement phase, if I was able to place my Bloodthirster here, more than 6 inches away from his armature that had fallen back, which could not shoot its guns because it had fallen back that turn, and survive the round. I would deny my opponent a bunch of secondary scoring because he had to take the objectives in the center of the battlefield. I would score the objective myself, and I would put my Bloodthirster in a literally perfect position to simply move around, deploy Scarbrand, and potentially kill 1 to 2 of his Titanic Knights on the follow-up turn. I thought that this play was amazing. I did some math in my head, because the only things that at this position would be able to attack me would be the Sororitas Knight Atropos, thanks to that towering keyword. Towing into the terrain allows him to fire through it, as well as this single Armiger Helverin, which, if we will remember our discussion from the last game, has Skysweeper protocols, meaning it wounds the Bloodthirster on 2s. Now, with that in mind, the Bloodthirster does have an armor save characteristic, which means he's able to take cover from the building in front of him, and he's able to potentially blank the Armiger Helverin damage. My head math said that it was about a 50-50 chance the Bloodthirster would survive these attacks. I don't know if that was entirely correct, but I was pinning my hopes for the game on that sequence of events. Unfortunately for me, it was not to be. I took 9 damage from the Skysweeper Protocol Armiger Helverin, and that allowed the Sororitas Knight Atropos to exactly kill the Bloodthirster in shooting. However, that did mean that that was 2 pieces in my opponent's army that were not attacking the Great Unclean. I thought the game was over at this point. I had not denied my opponent's scoring, and I had not scored the objective myself, and I had given up one of my most powerful pieces. But the dice decided that I should win this day regardless. My opponent's Crusader, Canis Rex, as well as a remaining Armiger Helverin fired into the Great Unclean One. Canis Rex charged and used his free stratagem to tank shock, as well as the Sororitas Knight Atropos charged as well. Through a staggering series of 4+ Feel No Pains, the Great Unclean One took from all of that attacking the combined total of about 1,300 points of knights, both in shooting and melee. Once the smoke had cleared, he took 13 damage, which was insane. To make matters worse, he swung back into the Sororitas Knight Atropos, a vehicle whose toughness characteristic is higher than the Great Unclean One's strength, unless I use my Nurgle's Gift to reduce his toughness, but I hadn't done that in this case. The Great Unclean One swung back, connected a knife attack and 2 big sword attacks through my opponent's armor and invulnerable saves, and ended up rolling boxcars for damage, dealing 16 damage to the Sororitas Knight Atropos, over half killing it in 1 attack. That then allowed me to kind of go for the throat. That sequence of events, despite the fact that I had lost one of my most powerful pieces, I had essentially done an equal amount of damage in my opponent's turn and then also survived. That did create some weird, interesting geometry problems with the Great Unclean One, actually opening space for the rest of my units to get in, but I was able to teleport Scarbrand and Bellicor around this side of the table to get Scarbrand in to try to kill Canis Rex. I was able to move my Lord of Change to get a line of sight to the Sororitas Knight Atropos, and Rodigus had appeared in the middle of the battlefield in order to push the Armiger Helverin in the center. All of this shooting, Scarbrand, Bellicor, and the Lord of Change, as well as Rodigus' flamethrower, all went into the Sororitas Knight Atropos in an attempt to kill it. Unfortunately, my opponents rotated his Ion Shield, so he had a 4+ invulnerable save, and it was his turn to roll fairly well. I didn't get too many wounds through, I only ended up doing 6 damage, but after having done 16 the previous turn, I did not feel bad about not doing the expected amount of damage there. That left the Sororitas Knight Atropos on exactly 4 wounds. Now remember that number because we went to the charge phase, and I was able to successfully make literally every charge, including a boxcars charge onto this Armiger Helverin from this Lord of Change, which was kind of insane. I was able to get Rodigus in on the center, Bellicor hit a random 9-inch charge into an Armiger Helverin, and Scarbrand hit his 6-inch charge to get into Canis Rex. Now, I did split my attacks with Scarbrand in an attempt to kill both of the big knights. He put 2 of his attacks into the Sororitas Knight Atropos, and the remainder of his attacks into Canis Rex. I also had a command point floating in case I needed to reroll anywhere, as well as Bellicor's Aura in order to reroll ones. Fortunately for me, that was enough damage. I ended up killing Canis Rex in 1 shot. However, my opponent rolled his saves out on the Sororitas Knight Atropos, which continued to save and did not receive lethal damage from Scarbrand. Canis then used Violent Last Stand on death to fight, punched back into Scarbrand, and one-shot him, which resulted in a deadly demise. None of the knights so far had exploded, but Scarbrand was the first. He ended up blowing up for exactly 4 damage on the Sororitas Knight Atropos, which zeroed out on its Feel No Pains and ended up dying as well. After the smoke had cleared, 2 of the 3 big knights on the battlefield had been destroyed. I had killed 2 of my opponent's armigers and was in solid control of the middle of the table. It was some of the most insane dice I've ever experienced in my entire life. The Grid and Clean one absorbing essentially my opponent's entire turn of shooting, cracking him back for almost literally maximum damage, and then I hit every charge out of Deep Strike and rolled almost exactly what I needed to kill all of his super heavies in the center of the battlefield. It was insane, and I apologize to my opponent profusely for rolling as absolutely ludicrously hot as I did. But that sequence of events allowed me to get out of round 4 at a 3-1 record. They do say you're better lucky than good, and I concur. And that put me into round 5 against Matthew and his Adepta Sororitas. Now, this round has special significance because your record after round 5 determines what bracket you end up in after the round 5 cutoff. Now, Nova Open uses an interesting system. It breaks the tournament into brackets, each of which is essentially a new tournament. So after the 5th round of the game, your placement and score determines what placing in the final tournament you are locked into. For example, the players in the top 16 after the 5th round can only ever get 16th place or higher, which means if you are not in that top 16 at the end of round 5, you have no chance of getting higher than 17th place. Now, I don't like this system. The intention is that it encourages players to remain invested in the tournament, even if they have lost a couple of their first games, because it's essentially a big reset button. You are now bracketed with players of somewhere around your skill level who you can then compete against to try to win the bracket as a separate tournament. However, in reality, I think it does a lot of the opposite because there's no longer an incentive to try to get higher in the tournament because your placement is secured after the end. A lot of players will simply drop after this and take the placement that they're given. That said, if I just won all my games, it wouldn't matter that much because I would just be in bracket 1 anyway. So next time I'll try to win in my games instead of losing my games. I have heard that that's a pretty good way to win tournaments. Now, Matthew's army was incredibly gorgeous. In fact, while we were at the table playing, the painting judges came up to offer him a space in the army showcase at the front of the hall. His army had a ton of conversions and Age of Sigmar models and custom models, and it was all super duper cool to look at. He ended up going first and pushing forward some of his units. I responded by taking his objectives on one side of the battlefield with the Great Unclean one and using Rodigus to screen out the other side. Now, an important part about this matchup is the Abbess Morvenval. She's basically included in every single Adepta Sororitas list because she's one of the most patently overpowered characters in the entire game. Fortunately for us, she's in Adepta Sororitas, an army with not a lot of other overpowered stuff, so she gets to survive. She gives her unit full hit and wound rerolls and attaches into Paragon Warsuits, who also gain +1 to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles. Given the fact that 90% of the time you want to be attacking monsters and vehicles with them anyway, most of the attacks that they make are going to be targeting those unit types, which means the entire unit wounds vehicles on no less than 4s, rerolls their hits and wounds, which means they will be converting most of those into damage, and those damage can be miracle diced for maximum damage potentially if you have dice in your miracle pool. Adepta Sororitas have a mechanic by which they generate dice that they will use over the course of the game to sub in for normal dice rolls. So if they pre-roll a die by generating it as a miracle die and rolling a 6 or a 5, they can sub that in for damage on a random damage weapon to ensure that they get close to or maximum damage. The typical play pattern with Adepta Sororitas is that you'll use light trash units to trade with your opponent over and over and over again until they have to move forward something important. You will then rapid ingress Morvenval just outside of threat range, move up with her, shoot that unit to death, charge, kill another unit, and then put herself in a position where she can overwatch a third unit. You can use miracle dice plus their full hit and wound rerolls to ensure that that overwatch kills something else, and at that point they've essentially tabled your entire army. In this case, her damage output into the Great Unclean ones is kind of inconsistent because they have a high toughness characteristic as well as a Feel No Pain. So even damage that she hands me, thanks to miracle dice, could first of all be blocked by invulnerable saves, which sisters don't like to see because they don't have any control over what I roll on my side. But also, the damage might not be maximum. So I was perfectly willing to allow her to attack and potentially charge into the Great Unclean ones if she decided to do so. And my opponent took the bait. He brought in Morvenval off the table edge really early, attacked her into Rodigus, unfortunately didn't get the charge out of reserve and just fired her guns. Didn't even quite kill him and allowed me to redeploy basically everything I had in order to respond to her. Once Morvenval was dead, very little on the table actually threatened the Greater Demons. My opponent did have a couple of Retributor squads that it did do a bunch of damage, but at that point, the writing was on the wall. I was able to essentially use the bulk of my army to just wash over my opponent and get myself to a 5-1 record. Now, unfortunately, my tiebreakers weren't the best ever, so that got me into bracket 2. So I was in the bracket of what I believe were 17th through 52nd place. Now with that, we entered the final game of day 1. And unfortunately, this was a game I was kind of dreading, not because of the player or the matchup that I was paired into, but of the mission that was preset in the event packet, which is an infamous mission around the Warhammer 40k community. That being supply drop. In my opinion, wholly inappropriate for competitive play. It should not be played as a competitive mission. The event organizers decided in this case that they would do it. On their heads be it, I guess. The reason that this mission is so silly is because of 40k's rule that, generally speaking, at the end of the final round of the game, the second player will score their primary objective points for controlling objectives on the map at the end of their turn rather than at the beginning of their turn when they normally do. The reason for this is that essentially the first player gets to set the tempo of the game. They're able to move first to project their threat ranges forward, to stage on terrain, and to threaten to take objectives. This will typically mean that the first player will get a slight advantage in most games of 40k. So the mission pack includes some comeback mechanics in order to make it more fair for the second player. And this, we call it bottom 5 scoring. At the bottom of the 5th battle round, the second player will score instead of at the top of their turn in the 5th battle round. This is one of the comeback mechanics that the second player has. This has made second player a pretty good seat to be in most cases in 10th edition 40k, although it is matchup and mission dependent. Supply drop is a mission in which objectives at the center of the battlefield will disappear as the game continues. As they do so, at the start of Battle Round 4 and the start of Battle Round 5, the other remaining objectives will become progressively more valuable, which means that as long as I can set up and survive for long enough as a second player to push up into the middle of the table and score the single remaining objective at the end of the 5th battle round, I will win almost regardless because it's worth the most victory points and my opponent has the least opportunity to contest me. And because the first player still scores normally, they will move up to try to take that objective, the other objectives will disappear, and then I can simply contest the objective, hand control back to them, they'll kill the stuff on the objective, I'll kill them, and I'll win the game at the end. The second player win rate is astronomical. As a result, it basically just comes down to a roll-off at the beginning of the game in order to determine who's going second. As an aside, Scorched Earth, the mission with the second worst go first win rate on this list, I also don't think is appropriate for competitive play for similar reasons. However, the event organizers decided to use it for the Supermajor Grand Finals, so I don't know. In this case, I was up against David and his Black Templars, who's a phenomenal opponent who unfortunately rolled too highly on the roll to go first, meaning he was required to take the first turn and I got the second turn. He pushed up really aggressively in order to try to take midboard objectives, which is what you're supposed to do. If you are going first, you basically need to make something happen whereby you're able to push primary in your own favor from the get-go. I was able to respond with my guns to clear off some of his utility units and then push onto my expansion objective and lock that down under my control with my 2 Grid Unclean ones, which his army didn't really have a good way of interacting with. I was able to use rapid ingresses and close deep strikes in order to get my Bloodthirsters into his 2 Repulsor Executioners, and while they did do pretty significant damage and almost killed Be'lakor on Overwatch, which would have been spooky, unfortunately the Bloodthirsters were able to take those out and leave my opponent with just a couple of infantry. The reality is that towards the end of the game, if he hasn't killed Rotigus, and Rotigus is able to get to the center of the battlefield, with the army build that my opponent has, in which the majority of his army is OC1, Rotigus actually cannot be contested on objectives. He reduces your OC characteristic to 0, which means he will automatically take objectives from you if he touches them. So as long as Rotigus survives, which he did, and gets to the center of the battlefield by the end of the game, I will win by a landslide, which is what happened. It was unfortunate because David was a phenomenal opponent and I really liked playing with him, but the mission is just so trash, and I was on the lucky side of the table for this one that I was able to take it down. No shade to my opponent. I think he played everything correctly. He played very aggressively, and he used a lot of reactive effects to try to maintain control of those objectives, but it was just a tough situation to be in. Now with that, we started at day 3, and at bright and early, I was up against Malachi and his 1,000 Sons. 1,000 Sons are another army that can do incredible single target damage. Although, kind of similar to Adepta Sororitas that we just talked about, they don't really love seeing invulnerable saves and feel no pains. They don't have a great way of getting around invulnerable saves besides just rolling devastating damage or just forcing a massive number of saving throws on them with things like Rubric Marine Flamers, which is inconsistent. I've also found that 1,000 Sons, because a lot of their buffs get pointed either at a particular unit, for example, giving full rerolls to Magnus for 2 command points, or targeting a single enemy unit. If you put a lot of pressure on them, you can kind of overload their capacity to buff their attacks through you. And without buffs from Kabbalistic rituals or stratagems, their attacks don't actually do that much damage. Now, with that in mind, I went first and actually ended up pushing really aggressively forward. I was able to get an attack with my Lord of Change onto one particular unit of Terminators. My opponent had a unit of 5 Terminators that he had deployed basically on the line, and I could get a little bit of line of sight. So I wanted to get some damage in early and protect the army with Be'lakor, making a big brick on my expansion objectives in order to try to secure those for early game scoring and force my opponent to come back into me in order to actually deal damage. Now, this attack ended up dealing a lot, and I think it killed 3 or 4 Terminators right off the bat, which was kind of an insane roll. My opponent just rolled, basically spiked low on his saves, and most of that unit went down. Now, in response, my opponent did have a huge unit of Rubric Marines, a big unit of max 10 Rubrics with the Umbralific Crystal, an enhancement that allows them to pick up off the battlefield and return, but you get to choose it in your own command phase. So you can see what secondary objectives are, and you can see entirely what your opponent does before you make the decision to pick up your unit. And Malachi ended up using it this turn in order to put a huge brick of 10 Rubric Marines into the fight right off the bat, accepting my challenge for a big brawl in the middle of the table. This allowed my opponent to arrive 9 inches away from my models and then use Temporal Surge to get his unit into the fight and get most of them line of sight into my greater demons. He also pushed forward aggressively with the rest of his army, turning on Magnus's extra movement characteristic aura in order to get his army engaged with mine. Now, with most of these attacks, because of the 18-inch non-operative effect that Be'lakor gives the army, he was only able to get his attacks into the Great Unclean Ones at the front, who are the most resilient models in my army. And so, with all of that shooting, he was able to do most of the damage to add the Endless Gift Great Unclean One, and he did kill Rodigus. However, left the rest of my army untouched. That aggressive push opened up a small gap in my opponent's backline, where I was able to get a Bloodthirster. In this case, I put Scarbrands down to try to get a bead on Magnus. I figured in this situation, if I was able to kill Magnus early on into the game, where he didn't have too many opportunities to activate, he is the single most dangerous unit on the table to my greater demons. If he goes down, we can probably roll out to an attrition win from there. So I committed to a plan where all of my demons would go and attack Magnus to try to kill him. Now, fortunately for me, the Kabbalistic Ritual Army rule is wildly inconsistent for the Thousand Suns player. It requires that you take a psychic test. You can empower the psychic test to ensure your psychic powers go off at high numbers. However, if you ever roll a double, you take D3 damage. And in this case, Magnus had rolled 2 in order to get his rerolls active and deal a Doombolt to my monsters. So he had already received 5 damage going in. Now, I knew I had to soften him up a little bit because he could use command point rerolls and Destined by Fate to try to blank incoming damage. I took a wound off with Scarbrand's Flamethrower, fired in with Be'lakor, who also did 4 damage, which was pretty nice. Got 2 devastating wounds through, and then a couple of wounds went through the save, and then lined up with my Lord of Change, piled all of his psychic weapons directly into Magnus, and ended up straight up just killing him. An interesting idiosyncrasy of the matchup is that the Lord of Change is incredibly good at shooting at particularly Magnus. It's just what we call a very good profile matchup. Magnus's toughness characteristic is 1 below the strength characteristic of the Lord of Change's Bolt of Change, which means he wounds him on 3s without any lost efficiency. It's AP 2, which is a relatively low AP. However, Magnus, in addition to having a 2+ save, has a 4+ invulnerable save, which means that there's, again, no lost efficiency there. So all you're doing is just hitting on 3s, putting your opponent on their invuln save, and Magnus reduces incoming damage from non-psychic attacks. Fortunately for me, all of my shooting, just about, at least to the Be'lakor and the Lord of Changes, is psychic shooting, so it's able to do maximum damage to Magnus, despite the fact that he has his protections up. Now, there is a stratagem the Thousand Suns can use in order to protect against psychic attacks, and that's kind of the idea, is that Magnus can protect against non-psychic. It will just cost you command points to protect against psychic. However, my opponent had burned down to 0 in order to use full rerolls on Magnus the subsequent turn. If you spend that command point on Magnus, you cannot then use the full reroll stratagem the next turn because you're down to 0. It costs 2. You're only going to gain 1 at the start of your turn. You'll be back at 1. So if my opponent turns on his defensive technologies at all, Magnus's damage output plummets through the floor on the subsequent turn. So my opponent elected to keep it for either Destined by Fate to 0 damage from the Bloodthirster that was coming in, or to save it if he survived to reroll his wound rolls the next turn. Ended up, unfortunately, failing out a couple of additional saves and getting killed by the Lord of Change without Skarbrand even having to get stuck in. Now, with that in mind, I had also placed my Bloodthirster. I think the situation was a little bit closer to something like this, in a way that he could get into the Rubric Marines over here. I ended up getting 2 Greater Demons on them and destroying that unit. Skarbrand ended up coming in and clearing out most of a Zangor Enlightened unit over here. And from there, the writing was kind of on the wall. My opponent did have another unit of Rubric Marines to bring off the table edge with a Infernal Master. He did end up killing the Bloodthirster with them. However, the remainder of my army was relatively unmolested, and I was able to progress that out to a fairly big win at the end. Now, at this point, I was getting a little nervous. I was 6-1 towards the top end of bracket 2, and take a screenshot at this point of myself and then several people who had won grand tournaments in the last couple of weeks. So I was feeling a little trepidations about my chances of going farther in the event. And funnily enough, in my last game against Thousand Suns, I was tabled up next to a Tyranid player who I watched score massive points against another Thousand Suns army. This was Will, and we ended up being paired for round 8, ostensibly the group semifinals. Now, Will was playing Tyranids, an incredibly scoring-heavy army that could potentially overwhelm my really low model count with crazy scores. I knew I had to play this matchup really aggressively, because if I ever took my foot off the gas and gave him the opportunity to just start scoring passively, he would outstrip me on score almost immediately. So I basically deployed a bunch of my demons directly on the line with the intention of engaging with his big guns as early as possible. And he took the fight. As soon as I had put most of my demons down on this flank, he had put all of his major cannons over there as well. Now, fortunately, I ended up winning the roll to go first, and so getting a cheeky shot off with my Lord of Change into the Zoanthropes. Now, the Zoanthropes have incredibly poor save characteristics, not very high toughness, and not a ton of wounds, which means that the Lord of Change is pretty effective into them because he doesn't have that great of armor penetration characteristic, but he has a bunch of attacks and all of them do multiple damage. So I would be happy if my opponent wanted to dedicate attacks and commit resources into attacking that Lord of Change rather than my tankier models that could fight out his big guns over a longer period of time. My opponent did not take the bait, however. In what I think was the correct call, he ended up pushing all of his units forward to try to engage with the Great Unclean One. I had killed about half the Zoanthrope unit, but the rest of his army was unmolested and ran up with advance rolls, gaining assault from the Hive Tyrant in order to gain a line of sight and range to the Great Unclean One. Literally every single attack in his entire army fired into this model. He charged it with the Gene Stealers, charged it with his Hormigaunt unit, used Neuraloids to grant those 2 units Synapse, and then used Adrenal Surge, a 2 command point stratagem, to grant them 5-up critical hits. And because of the Invasion Fleet army ability, which is the detachment my opponent was playing, had army-wide lethal hits as well. This combination means that if you roll a 5 or a 6 to hit on your units that attack 1,000,000 times, that hit is an automatic wound. You don't have to roll to wound. Now, the downside here is that oftentimes the AP characteristic of Tyranid units is relatively low. The upside for my opponent is that my save characteristic is trash. I only rely on invulnerable saves, which only have about a 50-50 chance to shake, versus many armor saves that will ignore about 33% of incoming damage. Mass numbers of lethal hit, improved critical, light attacks is actually a very good way to kill me. And that did end up taking out the Great Unclean One in one fell swoop. This push, however, left my opponent's backline open. Now, normally this would be fueled by Biovores, but my opponent used the Biovores Spore Mines to score points by placing them along my backline, leaving this section open to my attack, which I ended up doing. I had one little space where Skarbrand could hop into over here, create a Shadow of Chaos around himself, and then open up a space for the Bloodthirster to go in. Unfortunately, the way that the models were positioned particularly, I think it was something a little bit more like this. Skarbrand could only get a good charge into a single one of the Tyrannifexes, so I ended up dual charging one Tyrannifex with both Bloodthirsters, assuming that I could kill the first target with the first Bloodthirster and then cause Skarbrand to pile in and attack the second one. Unfortunately, my Bloodthirster, for the second time this weekend, decided to fail utterly and hand my opponent only a couple of saves that rolled relatively low on damage and didn't end up killing killing the Tyrannifex, which then required Scarbrand dedicate his attacks into the fight as well. I was hoping with this aggressive push, even though I was down my big tank, I could clear most of my opponent's big shooting and roll things out from there. Although, unfortunately, the Bloodthirster said no, he took the day off, and he decided not to do that. This meant that one Tyrannifex was dead. Scarbrand was able to go into the second Tyrannifex, but I wasn't able to clear that out. However, between shooting from the Lord of Change and a move and a charge from Be'lakor, I was able to sweep all the Tyranids off the center of the table. And Ronagus was able to take control of my expansion objective. This push caused my opponent to be forced to split focus. His big blast weapons largely had to choose where they were going to go, and most of them ended up firing into Be'lakor himself. The Hive Tyrant even pushed forward to get a charge on Be'lakor, and my opponent moved up to take the center objective from him. Because most of the Tyranid anti-tank shooting is blast, it couldn't go into Scarbrand without falling back the Tyrannifex, and my opponent valued the Rupture Cannon shots slightly more than the Tyrannifex's life. So in this exchange between a couple of blast weapons as well as a charge from the Hive Tyrant, Be'lakor took an immense amount of damage and was dropped to just a couple of wounds remaining. He was able to survive the Hive Tyrant, but failed to kill it on his return swing. The Tyrannifex ended up remaining stationary and firing 2 shots into Scarbrand, rolling double 6s to hit with both of them, which meant 2 lethal hits went through, and Scarbrand, I believe, was killed between a combination of that, the melee attacks from the Tyrannifex, an explosion from one of the other Tyrannifex, as well as some shots from a unit of Zoanthropes that were able to use their direct fire shooting to kill him. However, that left the Bloodthirster totally unmolested. Now, Be'lakor surviving was a huge boon for me because I was able to use the Lord of Change's ranged attack to kill the Hive Tyrant before the charge phase, which then allowed Be'lakor to charge and kill the Exocrine in the center of the battlefield as well. The Bloodthirster finally earned his keep and killed the Tyrannifex before piling in and using his end-of-turn mortal effect to kill a Biovore that was in my opponent's backline, who had been filling the backline of the table with Spore Mines for when my opponent got strong maneuver secondaries. All the while, Ronagus was busy slowly attritioning down all of the units on my opponent's other side of the table because he, at this point, was out of anti-tank shooting in order to deal with them. From there, we were able to roll things out into an attritional victory. While I did receive some damage, the subsequent turn from the remaining Exocrine and the Zoanthropes, it wasn't enough to really swing things, and I ended up engaging a lot of those units with the Lord of Change, who just fired his bolts into melee in order to clear out the remaining units on my opponent's expansion objective. And that gave me a big win to go 7-1 and make it into the Bracket 2 finals game. Now, looking at Bracket 2's top players, it was an absolute insane list of incredible players. I think all of them had both the tools and the know-how to beat my ridiculous stat check of an army. And in this case, the honor there went to Zach Point. Now, if you have been watching my live streams recently, you might recognize that name because Zach is in my T5S2 Online Invitational. He is one of the top 4 players out of a huge group of 600 players who participated in T5S2 Season 9. And he gave me a little taste of what that final invitational elimination stage might look like. He was playing Aeldari. As I mentioned right at the beginning of the video, we're able to capstone the Nova journey with 2 Aeldari players. Unfortunately for me, Zach does have an army that is teched to deal with huge amounts of high toughness wounds, unlike Joe's list from the very beginning of the event. He was playing an Aspect Host list, which does have Skyborn Sanctuary, which does allow one of his units to re-embark his transport at the end of each turn, and as a little bit of spice, he was also playing 30 Swooping Hawks. These guys have lethal hit attacks, so if they're able to go in, especially with support from characters like Lycus, who can give them 5+ criticals, the same thing that we just talked about in the Tyranids game, where massive numbers of low AP, 5+ critical, lethal shooting is absolutely terrifying for me. In addition to the fact that they also deal mortal wounds at the end of each of their movements. After they move up near you, they can do somewhere around 5 or 6 mortal wounds to you, then shoot you a million times and hand you something like 15 saving throws. So if your armor save characteristic isn't phenomenal, you're going to take a ton of damage from that. Now, I ended up playing this matchup a little aggressively. I ended up going second, forcing Zach to push forward with some of his Aspect Warriors to try to complete some secondaries, and then pushed up with my Lord of Change to clear out one of his Striking Scorpion units that was holding down an objective. That depressed my opponent's score slightly. However, it gave him an avenue of ingress with his fire dragon. So on the second turn, his Wape Serpent pushed forward, delivered 10 fire dragons in Fuegan to kill both Scarbrand and my Lord of Change. Now, Scarbrand should probably have been off the table. In hindsight, I kept him on the table in case the Swooping Hawks wanted to push really far forward and try to move block me or screen me out, so I could at least have a piece that could move forward to clear them. But in hindsight, I don't think my opponent was going to be doing that. So Scarbrand there was kind of just ancillary collateral damage. From there, his board control was immaculate, and I really wasn't able to gain purchase on the board. I was able to clear one of the Swooping Hawk units with the Grid Unclean one, who tanked a bunch of damage and also killed a couple of other Aspect Warrior units, but failed on an Overwatch to try to stop Lycus from taking my home objective, and that basically ceded board control to the Aeldari. They were able to cover the entire board in Aspect Warriors and slowly but surely kill my Greater Demons. I ended up with just Rodriguez holding down one of my expansion objectives, which did score me some points because my opponent was unable to take objectives from Rodriguez thanks to his OC reduction aura, so he was able to just farm that objective, which made the loss sting a little bit less, but unfortunately, it did go down to Zach, who ended up winning the bracket, coming in 17th place at the end of round 9. And that put my final record for the Nova Open 2025 at 7-2, which was much better than any of my wildest expectations with this insane meme of an army. That also put me at 5th place in the bracket, which put me at 21st place out of the entire tournament of 400 players, which is a standing that I am pretty happy with. All of my games at the event were incredible. All my opponents were absolute gentlemen and super duper fun to play with. I would play with any of them again at any time. I was a little bit worried about players getting a little bit aggressive or try hard once we got to that final 4 rounds, but everyone was an absolute sweetheart, and I super duper love playing all of them. So huge thanks to my opponents. Huge congratulations to Zach for taking down the entire bracket, and as well as Folger Piles for winning the entire thing, the current world champion and now current Nova Open champion. I hope you enjoyed this recap. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought about the format. I would offer to do more of them, but I don't know how often I'm going to get out to play Supermajor level events, so we'll see if we can make it happen a little bit more. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Lighter Creative for sponsoring this video, as well as everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.